Over 1,000 years ago, a Spanish kingdom was under attack by foreign invaders. And for many years, one small little fort withstood all of the assaults. And it was all due in thanks to a remarkable leader called El Cid. When their great leader died, his followers had an idea. They dressed his body all up in armor, and they tied a sword into his hands and propped him up on his horse. And with El Cid's body on his horse in the lead, the Spanish soldiers charged ahead. But they were quickly defeated because that act didn't fool anybody. A desperate trick that collapsed led to despair instead of victory. There will always be those who insist that this was the strategy of the early church. A dead leader propped up, maybe in armor, with a sword in his hand. Tell people, the chief priest said to the soldiers following Christ's resurrection, that his disciples came while you were asleep and they stole the body. That way, if the story of his disappearance gets out, you won't get in trouble with the governor. Thus, from the very beginning, the explanation was advanced that the disciples stole Christ's body in order to prevent the story of his resurrection from gaining foothold. A dead body, dressed in armor, sword in hand, mounted on a horse, a phony story. A dead body stolen by the disciples, a phony story. Never has a less satisfactory solution been proposed to such a difficult problem. The reason that this explanation was not persuasive then is the same reason that it is not persuasive now. It simply does not fit the facts. Let's consider some of the facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In the first place, let's consider the genuineness of the belief of all of his friends. Never has there been a more demoralized group of believers than that tiny little band of followers after Jesus' crucifixion. Only the women, amazingly enough, only the women were brave enough to mourn him in public. The men were all in hiding. They were fearful that the Roman soldiers were going to come after them next. And they were obviously stunned. They were stunned by the sudden turn of events that had happened in their master's life. In 1 week's time, 8-day period, they had seen their leader go from being cheered by the crowds on his entrance into Jerusalem to being crucified and hung between two thieves. We hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. But now he was dead, and so were their dreams. Now, we can understand that. We too have difficulty accepting the death of a loved one. And we might be able to appreciate the feelings of a little girl who wrote a letter to God. The letter went like this: Dear God, instead of letting people die and having to make new ones, why don't you just keep the ones you have now? We kind of wish that God would work like that, but He doesn't. We don't always deal with the idea of our endings. Someone posted an article on the floor of an obstetrical room in a hospital which said, recent research shows that the first 5 minutes of life are very risky. Underneath that note, someone else wrote, the last 5 minutes are not so hot either. We don't deal well with the fact of death, and neither did those early disciples. They were a disappointed, discouraged, defeated lot. And I can imagine that on that first Easter Sunday. It would be difficult to imagine them mounting any kind of a crusade at this point in their lives, much less turning the world upside down. Their grief was genuine, and it was almost debilitating. Just as genuine was their surprise at the strange tale that the women told. And you know the story by heart. Some of the women had gone to the tomb to prepare the body with spices and ointments. Reaching the tomb, however, they found that the stone had been rolled away. While they were trying to sift through this in their minds, 2 men in dazzling clothes appeared to them. And the women were terrified, and they bowed their faces to the ground. The men asked then the most startling question in the history of the universe. Why do you seek the living among the dead? Remember how He told you while He was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise again. The women remembered that Christ had spoken these very same words, and they rushed to where the men were hiding to tell them this most wonderful headline of all time. He is risen. And how did the disciples react? Luke tells us, but the words seemed to them to be an idle tale, and they did not believe them. How's that for a conspiracy theory? It is ludicrous to conjecture, as some have done, that the disciples simply made up this story of the resurrection, that it was like the dead body on the horse, a phony story. You see, something happened there at that tomb, and we know what it is. He is alive. There was a Norwegian pastor on a visit to this country, told the story of a devout old fisherman who lived alone, and when he was physically able, he walked 14 miles to church on Sunday. Wow. My little heart goes pitter-pat when I think of somebody doing that. 14 miles to church on Sunday. One Sunday, there was a terrible storm, and the old man arrived at the church very late. He was so late that all he heard was the final phrase of the pastor's benediction, now and forevermore. His friends tried to console him and tell him how very sorry they were that he had been disappointed after his difficult 14-mile walk. And he replied, "Disappointed? Never. It's worth walking 28 miles just to hear those 3 words, now and forevermore." See, we're confronted with the geniusness of the disciples' grief and the geniusness of their surprise at the idle tale of the women. But even more impressive, however, was the geniusness of the change that Christ's resurrection made in their lives. From defeated to dynamic, from heartsick to heroic, from doubting to death-defying. The radical change that took place in their lives of those who followed Jesus Christ is not the kind of change that one will find among persons who are perpetuating a fraud. One does not die defending a fairy tale. The disciples were witness to an event that divided all of human history into before and after Jesus. Christ has risen from the dead. The disciples were willing to give up everything that they had, including their lives, in defense of their contention that Christ was alive. Now, why were they willing to do that? Because they knew without a doubt that death no longer had dominion over them. Christ was alive, and they devoted the rest of their lives to spreading the good news. That was their task. And my friends, that is our task too. In his book, The Christian Way, Maxie Dunham tells an interesting story about a great Canadian photographer, Joseph Karsh. According to Dunham, Karsh only took one portrait of a person's back, that of Pablo Casals. And he took that in a small French abbey in 1954. Karsh writes that as he was setting up his equipment, Casals began playing Bach on his cello. Karsh was so enthralled by the music that he almost forgot while he was there. He took his portrait of Casals with a little bald-headed man bent over, playing his cello, frozen in time against a stone wall in that chapel. Karsh said that he took it that way to capture the loneliness of truly great artists and the loneliness of exile. Years later, when the portrait was on exhibition in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Massachusetts, another old, bald-headed man came day after day and stood for long moments at time in front of that portrait. The curator of the museum finally noticed him, and when his curiosity got the best of him, he walked over and he tapped him on the shoulder and asked why he stood there looking at the picture so long. And the old man, with obvious irritation, turned on the curator and said, "Hush, young man. Can't you see? I'm listening to the music." Somehow, in our witness to the world in which we live, we need to present a picture of Christ's life, His death, His resurrection, and His continuing presence with us, we need to present that picture that has authenticity, that is real and vibrant. In one of his writings, Rabbi Heschel said these startling words: "There are no proofs for the existence of God. There are only witnesses." There are no proofs for the existence of God. There are only witnesses. And he's right. I cannot open a text and prove to you scientifically that God exists. I can only testify to my own experiences and to the experiences of others. My own experience is that Christ is alive, because I have experienced Him in my life. And that was the testimony of the early church. But they were far more credible and far more dramatic than I. Why? Because their experience of Him was more dramatic. They had known Him before His crucifixion, and they encountered Him after His crucifixion. No wonder they were able to turn the whole world upside down. People who heard their testimony were convinced that they were telling the truth. Their words rang with authenticity. Something had happened not only to Christ, but to them. Their Lord, who was dead, was now alive. The testimony of the women had not been an idle tale, but had been an eternal truth. And the best evidence of that truth was the changed lives that occurred in those who knew Him then and those who know Him now. Do you know Him? Do you know Him? Is the good news of Easter just an idle tale in your life? Or is it real to you? I pray that we can all be counted among those who have experienced the love of Christ in our own lives and can easily and positively proclaim, He is alive. Yes, He is alive now and forever. Amen.